The message reached Prince Harry without warning. It was not a request, a private warning, or another carefully worded palace statement. It was a direct crown decree carrying King Charles's signature and the full authority of the sovereign. Within minutes, Harry's ability to publicly invoke the monarchy had been cut away. Meghan was staring at the final paragraph in stunned silence, and an old family conflict had become a constitutional act. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry broke the seal beside the table in his California home. His eyes moved quickly, then slowed as the meaning became impossible to escape. The Crown Representation Decree was not a family letter. It was a formal order, issued by the monarch to define who could speak or act in the name of the British Crown. Charles had used it to ban his younger son from campaigning, negotiating, or releasing statements suggesting royal authority without written approval. The Duke reached the second page and sat down. His public identity, charitable influence, and commercial value had remained tied to the institution he left. Now the king was ending that ambiguity, cutting away Harry's ability to live outside royal duty, while still drawing power from royal history. Meghan took the decree and read the section covering media projects, political causes, campaigns, and commercial ventures. Her expression changed when she realized how far the restriction could reach. "How far is he prepared to go?" she asked. Harry gave no answer. Charles had already answered through the document. Then Meghan found the enforcement clause. Any breach could trigger a review of Harry's remaining styles, ceremonial privileges, family links, and place within the royal house, the official structure organizing the monarch's working family and duties. This was no empty warning. It was a final boundary backed by deeper separation. Harry turned to the signature page and saw a handwritten sentence beneath his father's name. "The crown must no longer be used against the crown." The line came from the king's documented instruction attached to the decree, leaving no doubt about how Charles viewed the conflict. He no longer saw a wounded son speaking out. He saw royal identity being used as a weapon against the institution he had sworn to protect. Then Harry noticed another name. William appeared beside the enforcement provisions, authorized not merely as a witness, but as the royal figure overseeing compliance. Harry had expected punishment from his father. He had not expected his brother to stand behind it. In that instant, shock became betrayal, because the decree was no longer only about the crown. It was about blood. Behind the formal language of the decree stood 4 people bound together by blood, marriage, memory, and resentment. Charles saw a monarchy he believed was being weakened. William saw a future reign endangered by endless family warfare. Harry saw betrayal from the 2 men who once promised to protect him. And Meghan, watching her husband's expression harden, understood that the palace had not merely restricted his voice, it had challenged the identity they had built together. Harry pushed away from the table and walked across the room without speaking. The Duke title still belonged to him, but the Crown Representation Decree had stripped away something almost as powerful: the freedom to use royal standing as public authority. That mattered, because much of his influence came from the life he had left behind, while many of his future projects depended on audiences still seeing him as connected to the monarchy. "They are trying to erase me without having the courage to say it," Harry said. His voice carried more pain than anger. Meghan followed him, but he lifted one hand and asked for a moment alone. She stopped, because she knew this was not only a legal defeat. It was a wound delivered by a father and a brother who had once promised that blood would survive every royal storm. Across the Atlantic, William held another copy of the decree inside a silent London room. Catherine watched him read the same paragraphs again, searching his face for relief that never came. The future king understood why the restrictions mattered. Every interview, accusation, and private dispute linked to Harry could one day fall upon his own reign, weakening public trust before he even inherited the throne. "You know what enforcing this could cost," Catherine said quietly. William placed the document down, but kept his hand over it. He knew the decree might protect the crown, while destroying the last fragile path back to his brother. Success had arrived, dressed like loss. Meghan returned to the table and began listing the consequences. Interviews could be challenged. Charitable campaigns could lose royal language. Streaming projects, memoir discussions, and public appearances could face new scrutiny whenever their shared history became part of the message. She had helped build a life outside palace control, yet the palace had now reached into that life without crossing an ocean. Harry found the most painful detail in a confidential timeline attached to the decree. The restrictions had been drafted over several months. Charles and William had continued speaking with him during that time, offering careful words while legal advisors quietly prepared the boundary that now surrounded him. Then one date stood out. It pointed back to a royal ceremony, a private confrontation, and one reckless announcement that had changed everything. The decree had not grown from vague resentment. It had been born from a single moment when Charles decided that silence was no longer enough. Every royal crisis has a moment that appears ordinary, until history looks back and recognizes the fracture. For Charles, that moment came during a private reception following a major Commonwealth service at Westminster Abbey. Harry had returned, expecting a cautious conversation with his father. Instead, one heated exchange, one unauthorized announcement, and one door closing inside Buckingham Palace convinced the king that his son could no longer be trusted to separate personal grievance from royal authority. The tension had been building for years. Interviews, documentaries, private letters, and public appearances had kept dragging palace decisions into the open even after Harry stepped away from the working monarchy. That term meant the small group of royal relatives who carry out official duties on behalf of the sovereign. Charles understood why the distinction mattered. His son wanted independence, but every public attack still carried the force of royal history. The king had resisted formal punishment because he feared it would destroy what remained of the family. Each new restriction could look less like discipline and more like rejection. William saw the danger differently. The future king believed every unresolved crisis would one day become part of his reign, weakening the crown before he had even inherited it. Harry arrived after the Commonwealth service with a proposal already prepared. The ceremony itself was designed to celebrate the nations linked through the Commonwealth, a voluntary association connected by history and shared institutions. Yet behind closed doors, celebration gave way to confrontation. "I am launching an international initiative," Harry told Charles and William. "It will challenge how the palace treated my family, and I will use my royal platform to make sure people listen." William answered first. He warned his brother not to present the campaign as supported by the crown. The prince's voice remained controlled, but the message was hard. Harry could speak for himself, not for the institution he had left. "The monarchy does not control my truth because it fears public judgment," Harry shot back. His words landed like a final accusation. Charles looked at him with exhaustion, rather than anger, and that silence only deepened the wound. Then a courtier's phone vibrated. Harry's team had already released a prepared announcement, describing him as a royal founder acting from a position of hereditary duty. That phrase suggested his campaign carried authority simply because of the family into which he had been born. The statement had gone public before the meeting had even ended. Charles read it once, then again. The king removed his glasses and placed them beside an untouched cup of tea. According to the documented account later prepared for palace advisors, he looked toward William and said, "He has made the decision for us." That evening, Charles ordered constitutional advisors to draft an instrument separating Harry's personal voice from the authority of the crown. William agreed with the decision, but demanded one final chance to confront his brother directly. Before the decree could be signed, the brothers would meet alone. Neither man intended to retreat. There were no cameras, no communications advisors, and no carefully arranged family audience. Only William and Harry stood inside the private sitting room, separated by years of accusation and one unsigned decree resting on a table between them. The future king had been sent to offer a final choice. The younger brother believed he had been summoned to surrender. What followed was not a negotiation. It was the collapse of everything they had avoided saying. William placed the document between them and kept his voice steady. The decree would be signed unless Harry stopped using royal identity as leverage in media disputes, commercial projects, and public campaigns. A royal decree was a formal command issued under the sovereign's authority, and this one would draw a hard line between private speech and official crown power. The prince insisted that his brother could still speak freely as a citizen. He simply could not speak as though he remained part of the working monarchy. Harry pushed the paper away. "You are hiding behind legal words because you are afraid of what people might believe," he said. The Duke accused William of protecting the palace from scrutiny rather than protecting the family from pain. He said the crown wanted obedience without accountability, silence without healing, and loyalty without truth. William moved his chair closer. Anger finally broke through his restraint. He said the conflict was no longer about criticism. It was about Harry demanding complete independence, while continuing to use royal connection whenever it strengthened a speech, a contract, or a campaign. The future king reminded him that every public claim carried consequences for Charles, Catherine, the children, and the institution they would inherit. Harry's expression hardened. He revealed, through a recorded private conversation later documented by palace officials, that Meghan had urged him to make one final broadcast. The planned address would expose everything the palace had tried to contain, including details from his latest conversations with Charles. He believed the public deserved the full story. She believed silence would allow the monarchy to define them forever. William did not look surprised. The prince told him palace officials already knew about the broadcast. Its proposed timing, central claims, and references to private royal discussions had reached London days earlier. If Harry released it, Charles would sign the decree immediately. No further warning would come. No second meeting would be offered. Harry stood and left the document untouched. "Then he will have to silence his own son in public," he said. William remained seated. His answer came quietly, but it struck harder than anger. He is already prepared to do exactly that. The brothers' meeting ended without agreement, and the real battle moved beyond family pain into the machinery of royal power. The decree carried Charles's name, but it had been shaped inside rooms where sentiment was treated as a danger. Constitutional advisors studied every phrase. Senior courtiers tested every possible consequence. William demanded protections for the future of the monarchy. Yet amid the legal language and institutional calculation, the final decision still rested with one grieving father sitting alone before dawn, reading a document that would formally limit the voice of his own child. Charles turned back to the opening page and read it again. His advisors had warned that the crown needed a clear separation between a private relative expressing personal views and a royal figure appearing to exercise inherited authority. The crown was not simply the monarch as a person. It was the legal and public institution through which royal power and duty were carried. Without that distinction, every statement from Harry risked sounding like a rival version of palace policy. William had pushed hardest for clarity. The future king believed uncertainty had become its own danger. Each interview, campaign, or commercial project connected to his brother created another question about who truly spoke for the monarchy. He knew that confusion weakened trust, and whatever Charles failed to settle now would eventually fall upon his own reign. The king reached the enforcement clause and stopped. That section allowed further action against Harry's remaining privileges if the decree was ignored. Charles traced one line with his finger, then looked away. He could protect the institution with a signature, but the same signature might close the final door between father and son. Camilla entered quietly and found him holding an old photograph of William and Harry as boys. She did not offer false comfort. The Queen Consort understood that hesitation had already cost the family years of peace. "Delaying this will not bring them back to who they were," she said. Charles lowered the photograph, but he did not release it. A senior advisor then delivered the one fact that changed the mood. The decree had been deliberately written to avoid stripping Harry's title immediately. It created a final boundary, not total exile. That mattered because Charles still wanted discipline without erasure, and the palace still hoped restraint might prevent permanent separation. William had insisted on one more protection. In a documented instruction attached to the final draft, he requested a confidential route back through sustained compliance, private mediation, and an end to public attacks. Mediation meant a structured private process designed to help both sides speak without turning every grievance into another public battle. If Harry accepted those terms, direct dialogue with the sovereign could eventually reopen. Charles placed the photograph beside the decree. Then he signed. The king set down the pen and ordered the document delivered before Harry's planned broadcast could be recorded. From that moment, royal authority and public defiance were racing toward the same deadline. By the time Harry understood how quickly the palace had moved, the decree was active, the broadcast was collapsing, and Meghan was about to face the first real consequence. The consequences did not arrive gradually. Calls were cancelled. Legal teams demanded clarification. Producers asked whether Harry could still appear beneath royal branding. Charitable partners wanted assurances that their work would not be trapped inside a constitutional dispute. And in the center of that confusion stood Meghan, phone in hand, hearing one professional relationship after another hesitate over the same question: what remained of their public power once the crown had drawn a line through it? Harry's planned broadcast collapsed first. Advisors warned that revealing confidential conversations with Charles could activate the decree's disciplinary review, a formal process that could examine his remaining royal privileges and ceremonial links. The program had been designed as his strongest public answer, but now every sentence carried risk. Silence looked like surrender. Defiance looked like self-destruction. Meghan ended another tense call and placed her phone face down. A charitable partner had removed wording that implied Harry still spoke with authority inherited from the monarchy. A producer had demanded new legal protections. She looked at her husband and told him the decree had made every future project vulnerable to palace interpretation. Harry's anger broke through. He said giving in would prove that Charles could control him from thousands of miles away. The Duke insisted that the crown had no right to decide where his personal story ended and royal history began. Meghan answered sharply that reckless resistance could cost them contracts, alliances, and the credibility they had spent years building. Pride, she warned, would not protect their children or their future. The room fell quiet. Their legal advisor then delivered a recorded briefing that changed the argument. The decree was narrower than they had feared. Harry could still criticize the monarchy, discuss his own experiences, and defend his family. What he could not do was present himself as an alternative royal authority or reveal protected communications, meaning private exchanges covered by official confidentiality. Meghan heard a possible escape. Harry heard a carefully built cage. Then a second envelope was discovered beneath the formal papers. It carried no royal seal and no legal warning. Inside was a personal letter from Charles, written separately from the decree. The king asked his son to choose one private conversation before making any public response. He did not demand an apology. He did not offer to withdraw the order. He simply asked Harry to speak to him without cameras, advisors, or prepared statements. Meghan expected rejection. She watched him reach the final line, set the letter down, and then pick it up again. Harry read it twice. When he finally spoke, The anger had changed into something quieter and more dangerous. He asked for a secure call with his father alone. For the first time since the decree arrived, Harry stopped preparing to fight and began wondering what might remain if he finally spoke as a son rather than a prince. There were no aides listening, no palace transcript, and no wife or brother seated nearby. Charles and Harry spoke privately, stripped of ceremony and surrounded only by the history neither could escape. The king did not withdraw the decree. The duke did not apologize for everything he had said. Yet during one long silence, both men finally recognized the same painful truth. Their battle over the crown had become a substitute for the conversation they feared having as father and son. Charles spoke first. He said the decree concerned royal authority, not Harry's right to describe his life, defend Meghan, or disagree with the monarchy. Royal authority meant the official power carried by the sovereign and those formally acting on the crown's behalf. The king insisted that his son's private voice remained his own, but it could no longer be presented as though it carried institutional weight. Harry answered without anger. He admitted that royal identity had shaped every part of him, even after he left its duties, restrictions, and protection. The Duke said he had used that connection because he could not simply remove his birth, his memories, or the expectations placed upon him since childhood. To the palace, it looked like leverage. To him, it felt like survival. Then the wound opened. Harry asked whether his father had ever considered how abandoned he felt when security, access, and trust seemed to disappear at once. His voice tightened as he described losing not only a role, but the belief that the family would still protect him outside palace walls. Charles did not interrupt. The king answered slowly. He said every private approach seemed to return later, as part of another interview, documentary, or public confrontation. He no longer knew whether he was speaking to his son or to material that might one day reach an audience. That fear had turned caution into distance, and distance into silence. Harry said nothing for several seconds. Then he made the choice neither side had expected. According to the secure call summary later documented for both legal teams, he agreed not to release the planned broadcast and not to disclose their recent private meetings. He was not yielding because the decree frightened him. He was stopping because one more public strike would destroy the last personal connection between them. Charles promised that compliance would not be treated as humiliation. He offered a future meeting with William, but only if no advisors, statements, or recordings were involved. The next conversation would belong to the brothers, not the institution. When the call ended, Harry found Meghan waiting. He told her he would accept the decree's legal boundary in a public response. She stared at him in disbelief. His decision changed the battle inside their home, but outside, the world had already turned the decree into a public verdict on loyalty, power, and identity. By sunrise in London, the decree was no longer a private family weapon. It dominated broadcasts, newspaper stands, palace gates, and conversations across 2 continents. Some saw a sovereign finally protecting the institution. Others saw a father using the crown to control a wounded son. But one image captured the entire crisis. A silent crowd outside Buckingham Palace, watching Harry's carefully written response appear on their phones at exactly noon. British broadcasters called it the clearest separation yet between Harry's private identity and the authority of the working monarchy. That term referred to the small group of royals who officially represent the sovereign through public duties. The distinction mattered because the Duke could still speak as an individual, but he could no longer allow audiences, partners, or governments to mistake his voice for royal policy. Commentators divided within hours. Some argued that Charles had restored constitutional clarity by defining who could speak for the crown. Others said the king had turned a wounded family relationship into a public act of discipline. The argument reached beyond one household because the monarchy depended on a single recognized source of authority. Two competing royal voices could weaken trust at the center of the institution. William watched the coverage from Buckingham Palace without satisfaction. The prince heard broadcasters describe the decree as decisive, disciplined, and necessary. Yet none of those words softened the personal cost. Public approval could protect his future reign, but it could not restore the brother who now saw him as an enforcer. Across the ocean, Meghan read Harry's final statement before publication. She stopped at the line promising respect for the new boundary and asked whether he truly wanted to sound so restrained. The Duchess feared that accepting the order would allow the palace to claim victory. He answered that open defiance would only confirm every accusation made against them. Then the front pages appeared. One major newspaper printed Charles's signature beneath the enormous headline, "The Crown draws the line." The image transformed a private command into a national symbol. Outside the palace, the crowd grew quieter as noon approached, with hundreds of people holding their phones and waiting for the response that could either calm the crisis or explode it. At exactly 12, Harry published his statement. The Duke confirmed that he would respect the constitutional boundary while keeping his right to speak as a private citizen. He did not attack his father. He did not mention William. He did not release the confidential conversations Meghan had once urged him to reveal. The immediate threat of open defiance ended. Yet victory brought no celebration. Charles had secured the crown. William had protected the future. Harry had preserved his private voice. Meghan had watched their royal power narrow in public. Once the headlines faded, all four would have to face what the decree had truly taken, and what, against every expectation, it had preserved. The decree succeeded because Harry obeyed it. The monarchy's authority was clarified, the planned broadcast disappeared, and the crown no longer faced a rival royal voice claiming the freedom to act without responsibility. Yet Charles did not experience victory. William did not feel vindicated. Meghan did not forget the shock of watching their public influence contract overnight. What emerged instead was a harder, quieter result. The conflict was finally forced into boundaries none of them could ignore. Harry remained outside the working monarchy, the small group of royals who officially performed duties for the sovereign, but he kept the right to speak as a private citizen. What changed was the source of his authority. He could still defend his family, describe his experiences, and challenge palace decisions, but he could no longer present personal campaigns, commercial ventures, or grievances as extensions of the crown. Charles had protected the institution without immediately taking away his son's title. The king chose restriction over exile, accountability over erasure. That decision mattered because the monarchy needed one clear voice. Yet the father behind the sovereign still refused to close every path back. Meghan sat with Harry after the public response had been released. She told him the decree had permanently reduced their influence and allowed the palace to define the limits of their future. The Duchess feared that restraint would be mistaken for defeat. Harry answered with painful calm. Continuing the war, he said, would have reduced their family to nothing but retaliation. Every interview would have demanded another answer. Every private wound would have become public material. They might have preserved attention, but they would have lost whatever remained of trust. William received a private message from his brother later that evening. Harry admitted that their meeting had been brutal, but necessary. The prince read the words twice, feeling the cost behind every line. Then he replied with only 4 words, "We speak in person." Charles received Harry's written acceptance through a secure palace channel. The monarch placed it inside the same red box that had once carried the decree. A red box was the official case used to deliver important royal and government papers to the sovereign. By keeping the acceptance beside the punishment, he preserved both consequence and possibility. The king then issued a documented instruction confirming that no further action would be taken against Harry's remaining status, as long as the boundary was respected. No new threat followed. No final humiliation was added. Charles had silenced a competing royal voice, but he had not erased his son. Meghan had been stunned. Because the palace finally used power they believed it would never dare exercise. William had defended the future crown at the cost of brotherhood. Harry lost the freedom to stand inside and outside the monarchy at the same time, but gained one final chance to rebuild what public warfare had nearly destroyed. The crown survived without his authority. The family survived because his pain was no longer being used as a weapon. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.